Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Yeshiva League Pass Face-Off. Welcome to our third season. I have an incredible schedule planned ahead for all of you guys. But before we begin, I want to start by mentioning our sponsor. And once again, we are sponsored by the Weiselberg Law Firm. For 16 years, you have entrusted Elliot with the growth and guidance of your kids. And now it's time to let him do the same for your family's most important asset, your home. Admitted in both New York and New Jersey, Elliot can help guide you through any residential or commercial purchase, sale, refinance, or lease with championship quality and award-winning care. If you're looking for your commercial coach or a new home is your goal, reach out to the Weiselberg Law Real Estate Services today at 917-952-2597, or you can email them at wiselawesc@gmail.com. Reminding everybody once again, that's the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely. Welcome back, everyone. It's great to be back. My name is Josh Cash, for those who don't remember, and I'm joined today by Avidan Berman, the director of hockey over at Flatbush for both middle school and high school, obviously. We are not talking about middle school today. It is our first episode of season 3, as I mentioned. And with that being said, we are going to dive into the overall picture and the overall layout of what we believe is going to transpire this coming season for both JV and varsity. We're going to do it all in one shot. Avidan, before we begin, though, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited to get started.
All right, so let's jump right into it. So we'll start with JV, and we'll work our way over to varsity. So let's begin. Let's very, very briefly recap what happened last year in JV. Ultimately, forget regular season. Let's go right to the playoffs. 6 teams make it in. You got MTA, SAR, TABC in the West. You've got Flatbush, North Shore, DRS in the East. North Shore plays MTA in the quarterfinals. They win. They're in the semis. Flatbush plays SAR in the quarterfinals. SAR wins there in the semis. DRS and TABC, having been the 1 seed in each division, hosted the semis and went straight there. So SAR now matches up against DRS, and TABC now matches up against North Shore. TABC takes on North Shore, blows them out of the water, moves on to the championship. With all due respect to North Shore, a lot of people anticipated that happening. DRS, on the other hand, gets a closer game with SAR, beats them 4-2 in a back-and-forth game, where DRS was able to find their rhythm late despite trailing to SAR, and overall makes their way back to the championship for the 2nd straight year. And then we have a thriller, a 1-0 lead for DRS early on. They find a way to take a lead over TABC, who comes in the higher seed. TABC finds a way to tie it up on a power play. It's 1-1. It goes to overtime. A couple minutes in, TABC captain Aiden Rousman nets the game winner. Great game overall. It really couldn't have been any closer, both scoreboard wise and the way that the actual game played out. You, myself, Elliot, we were all there. We were all able to witness it. And we all really weren't shocked about the fact that it was those 2 teams in the championship game and the fact that it played out the way it did. But obviously, got to give credit where credit's due. And despite the loss, DRS put a heck of a fight. So that sets us up for another interesting and very exciting year that everyone's been anticipating for a while. And here we are. So let's talk about what we've got so far. We've divided it into 3 categories so far. And this has come across a panel of coaches from around the league that have done it in past years and who will be involved in the league this year, given our thoughts. So let's get into it, Abdan. Why don't you let us know what's going on and sort of how we have divided up the rankings?
Okay, so we have the 3 different categories. The first one is the Prove It, and that's the group of teams who need to, show us more than they did in the previous year, or more than what we expect, right? The next one is In the Hunt, right? Teams are hanging around the lower seeds of the playoffs, and then you have the contenders, are the teams that who most consider are locks for the playoffs, and teams that could potentially go deep into the playoffs.
Yeah, and let's keep in mind, by the way, none of this, obviously, it should be taken very seriously. None of this should be taken to heart. It's where we believe for people who have been around this league coaching in the past and now have the opportunity to bring it to you. But other than that is also the fact that all of this could be subject to change. So we don't know. That's
Yeah,
just the simplicity of it.
I mean, part of even like let's say the prove it category, right? Like part of that is also like there are teams that we don't know what they will do, right? Like we
Exactly.
don't know all the players who are going to every single school, especially in JV, right? So like let's say MTA or someone like that, like me being in New York and I'm thinking about where MTA is going to finish. I don't know, so I might put them a little bit lower than a person who knows more, you know? So it's not be where you are isn't necessarily a slight to you. It could just be a lack of knowledge, you know, even around the league.
Yeah, it could be that way. And keep in mind, it doesn't take away, like, rankings from last year or where teams finished last year were a big part of these rankings. But there's also some other factors we take into account because this is JV. We try not to harp on it too much, but obviously a lot of addition for freshmen coming in this year could have played a factor. So we really don't know, but we'll get to it. And without further ado, let's hop right to it. Let's start. I think it'd be smart. Let's work our way, I guess, bottom up. Gives us, I think, a little more
Yeah.
anticipation. Why don't you go ahead and get us started off with what we have? But or rather, before, why don't you actually let everyone know also? Let's talk about the division circumstances as well as, well, really the league circumstances, as well as also maybe how the playoff, jump all the way to the playoff bracket and how that sort of seeding works out too.
Yeah, so in JV there's only one division this year. Yeah, it's 9 teams. And from that, the top 5 teams make the playoffs. Now, with that, the first round is the 5 versus the 4. The second round is the winner of that game against the 1 seed, and then the 2 versus the 3. And then the game after that's championship. So the winner of those 2 games.
Yeah, so very simple. And there are only 9 teams in the JV league. So really, I mean, already more than half of the teams in this JV league are making the playoffs. So the odds to get in have to be somewhat relatively high for all of these teams automatically. The
Yeah,
fact that everyone at the very least pretty much has at least a 50% chance of making it in, right? Even if you're not necessarily going to be a contender right away. So, I think that's a bonus, really. I think it's going to be very interesting that that's how it plays out this year.
Yeah, I'll also add that like last year, if we were making a similar list in varsity, most teams I think probably would have said YDE might have been a prove it team, and then they ended up being the second best team in the East.
Yeah.
So it's just something to note that like how preseason means very, very little.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if we're gonna jump right into the prove it, right? We're looking at Rambam, MTA, and YDE. I think in terms of Rambam, they certainly have a lot to prove. They have Moshe Holzer, who was their top scorer last year, but they also lost the best the best goalie in JV in Rami Kesak. And then it's going to be a young team that doesn't have as much experience, so it's going to be on them to prove it that they could take the next step or or fall behind.
Yeah, and I don't think that, at least when it comes to Moshe Holzer, was a top scorer last year. He was not just a top scorer amongst freshmen. He was one of the best freshmen in the league when it came to performance. The kid scored 18 goals in 10 games last year for a team that really wasn't, in contention for anything come playoff time. But during the season, they were in a lot of close games. Now, you mentioned Rami Kesak, their goaltender, was a big reason why that came to be, and they lost him. So obviously, those circumstances change a little bit. The plan changes for how this team is going to try to find ways to win, obviously. But in terms of his ability to put the ball in the net, I wouldn't say that, you could count them out automatically off the scoreboard. Where it's going to fall short, as you mentioned, other than the goaltending, and I can jump into this having coached that team last year, is the fact that they're just not such a deep team. And sometimes, we see it where all you need sometimes is one really, really good player to be able to take your team to a level where it gives you a chance to compete for a high, for a high prize. But the problem is that really, I just don't know that, even a player as talented as Moshe Holzer is going to be able to take that team to compete at levels with guys, as we'll mention later on in the preview for JV.
Yeah. It'll be on his teammates to level up, to show that they're at the level to, to help him because he'll do enough on the scoring end. It's going to be on everybody else to be secondary contributors.
Yes, absolutely.
So we can go to the next one, which is MTA.
Yeah.
They do have a nice mix of 9th and 10th graders. It's a pretty big team.
Yeah,
And
and they made the playoffs last year also. Let's not
yeah,
forget about that.
yeah, they made the playoffs, and they're a team that could certainly end up at at a higher level and competing for a playoff spot. They're probably right on that cusp. Um, they what they'll need to do, they'll have to win the games they're supposed to win, and then steal and the tight come away with some with tight wins also. And when you have kids with players with experience, that's important. I mean, like, I'm looking at the roster now, and I would venture to say that most of their team is 10th graders, so it's a good start for them.
Yeah, it is considering, and it's not just 10th graders, like just being 10th graders. These are 10th graders who, as freshmen last year, played some big roles for a playoff team that was really close to getting to the semis last year.
Yeah, definitely. Look, they played North Shore.
Yeah, they played, and it was a close game. They went
Yeah,
down 3-0. I had an opportunity to play witness in person at that game. But although they lost in the end, and they came back, they made it a 3-2 game in the end. They controlled that game. They didn't, they went into North Shore. North Shore was really good in their own gym. They had their strategies that they played out. We won't get too far into that, but they found a way to neutralize North Shore's game plan of liking to use their floor to their advantage in the space and use their speed. And MTA really played a nice possession game, and they took advantage. And in the end, really, the difference maker was the fact that Ryan Stallwark was a net for North Shore over a couple of other goalies, you could have named in the league who had one of the better seasons last year amongst JV goalies.
yeah. And look, North Shore they were good. Like, we lost
Yeah,
to them in North Shore. We lost to them. So, all full respect to being able to go through, head to head to them, score goals in their gym, and having that experience will generally lead you an opportunity to be a playoff team. So, and then the last one on the list is YDE. YDE, they called up some of their players in the middle of last year over to varsity. They did not make the playoffs, but they also had a very good freshman class.
Yes.
Um, they picked up their middle school team in New York went to the semis, and they played Halb and lost. They had the I'm now dropping the name, but one of their players broke the record for goals in a season in middle school. I'll get that right now. But yeah, Stephen Franco.
Yeah.
So, and they had players around him. It wasn't just a one-man show, even though he did score 40 plus goals in 10 games. But they'll be a team that's pretty decent. Like, they're not going to be an easy out, but they do have a lot to prove, because it's going to be a lot of younger kids trying to help their team make the next step.
Yeah. So you see them as a team that, I mean, obviously any team, anything can happen. We know that. We've seen that in the past in this league, whether it be one or two divisions. It's been a very long time since this league has just been one division. But with that being said, there do come times where we've seen that a team of younger players, a team of freshmen can bring a lot of success to a school.
Look,
We saw
my
last year.
Rambam
We'll
team
get into it.
also.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
yeah, you coached Rambam in 2013-14. That team went to the championship on the strength of a lot of freshmen.
yeah,
And last year, I mean, the most recent example, SAR's team last year, predominantly freshmen. We'll get into that when we talk about them in this segment of the JV episode. Or in the JV portion of this episode. So, and I don't want to shy away. Also, like you mentioned, 40 goals. I get it. He's jumping up a year, and he's going to be playing with kids a year older than him now. But there's got to be some level of respect, and there has to be
yeah,
some level now of we got to focus in on this player. We know he's capable of lighting it up, even against the best of the best potentially, which we'll obviously
yeah.
see as the season plays out.
Yeah, look, I saw him like at least, I think it might have been 4 goals against Hafter, who was also a very good team in middle school last year. So, like, he did it against everybody. So, and you have to in order to score that number.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. But so we can move to the next portion here, is in the hunt.
Yeah. So
So we have
that's all we have now for our prove it category. So we have YDE, Rambam, and MTA. And again, anything can change here. Anything can change.
yeah,
Let's let our viewers know that to keep that in mind.
yeah, and then in the hunt, which is Hafter, Frisch, and Ramaz. We can start with the first one there, which is Hafter. Hafter, they did not have a JV team last year, but their now 10th graders got their experience playing in varsity, which is a very strong thing to have. My first year at Flatbush, which was 2 years ago, we did not have a JV team. And then when my freshmen came back down to JV the year after, they all felt over prepared for JV, and they felt, to an extent, that it was easier because they were so used to playing against bigger, faster, stronger players. So they're coming in. They're gonna have Blonder in net, and they're gonna be led by Zachy Weiss. Zachy Weiss was a second line player at the varsity level, and he was an effective second line player.
Yeah, and for a team that made the playoffs with a
Yeah.
group of younger players, let's keep that in mind.
With a really difficult schedule.
Yes.
Hafter did not have an easy schedule in varsity
He did
last
not.
year. And so when you take all that into account, you expect him to be able to come in, score a ton of goals, and do a lot of the heavy lifting and when they need goals. And then they have, talent or spread around on that team to be able to be secondary players to help him out.
Yeah. And again, this is also a team that if I'm looking at them right now, even though they didn't have a JV team last year, their middle school was a solid team last year. They were a contender in the playoffs. Obviously, championship contender, they didn't get to be at that level. But with that being said, they enjoyed a successful regular season in middle school last year. They played well in the playoffs for as far as they were able to go. It was not like they just got smoked and that was it, like the end to their era. No, like knowing they were all going to come up and play for this high school and knowing that they were going to have to, probably field a JV team this year because not have to probably like Hafter knew, I think, that this year, I think they planned for this year having their kids play from, a JV age last year on the varsity level. And knowing that if you gave experience to a guy like Zachy Weiss, who is one of the best players in his age class, that's a huge, huge advantage now that he has, and it's going to make him stronger as a player, similar to the way you mentioned you did with your group of freshmen when they came back and played for their sophomore year in JV last year.
Yeah, I compare it very similar to what I did with Joe Catton, who is now one of the better players in varsity, but in JV he scored probably like 12, 13 goals in his freshman year varsity, which I believe is similar to what Weiss put up. And then he's going back down, and then the game just seems slow for them, and they're able to just stick handle around, get shots going.
Yeah,
really pump teams. So, I think again they belong in the hunt because they do. The supporting cast, especially the freshmen, will need to step up and give us support, but they do have a good base.
Yes, we can certainly speak to that just based off of having coached them against them in middle school level. With that being said, so let's move on to our next team. So if I'm not mistaken, then, so our next two teams, I know in the hunt, we have Ramaz and Frisch. I guess let's talk a little bit about Frisch first, because we sort of have a little bit more on them. Frisch had a JV team last year, and I think, it's going to be very interesting to look at them because just looking at, and I said freshmen coming into these schools is going to play a factor. I think if you look at Frisch, they got one of, it seems to be the best selection of freshmen, in terms of who came into their class this year that they'll have, to be able to roll with in JV this year.
Yeah, I mean, names like they have, they picked up Teller and Perlman. They picked up, there's another one in there.
Pieces for their team last year. Ryan,
yeah,
Teller,
we're both in. Yeah,
Sammy
Charlie
Perlman was a
Butler.
captain on Yavna, and then
it was Charlie Butler's in there. They picked up a really strong freshman class. They were I would think you would say they were a bubble team in JV, but that also was partially due to their schedule.
They did have a tough schedule last year, and they still were really close to making the playoffs. They played against MTA last year, in MTA in a huge game, and that was their last breath that they could control whether they'd get into the playoffs, and they won that game. They won that game on a last-second goal by one of their defensemen, Ryan Bugsbayev, who had an absolute snipe from the right point, right off a face-off win. He shot it on a one-timer and beat Ozzy Dreyfus, and Frisch ended up winning the game, but they also needed a little bit of help from other teams playing. They needed some help from Orya Soral to go and win a game, and that didn't take place, and that was the reason they ultimately ended up short of the playoffs in JV last year.
Yeah. So I think you look at them and you say there's something, they didn't make the playoffs last year, but they also got a really good freshman class. this freshman class could definitely push them into the playoffs, and because the talent truly is excellent, and they also have a good group of 10th graders who experienced disappointment last year. And
Yes.
that's always a big thing when you're just there are two ways to react to disappointment, right? You could get down on yourself or you could push yourself to be better. So if these 10th graders push themselves to be better, and then they have the really talented 9th graders coming with it makes them a dangerous team that could be that could push them into being a contender versus being a bubble team.
Yeah, it really could. And all of this obviously comes to exception if the ninth graders are able to find ways to be very, very talented, on a high school level where they're playing kids who are a year older than them now. With that being said, I personally wouldn't put it past this ninth grade class, knowing, who's probably going to get time, who's going to be able to develop really well under the coaching staff there, along with that group of 10th graders, as you mentioned. I certainly want to give them a shot. And I think that's really I think this category is the perfect fit for them at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And then we have Ramaz is the last team. Ramaz is a very difficult team to to make a good judgment on because they didn't have a JV team last year. Or, well, they did, but didn't. And they made some good pickups. For the 10th grade class, they picked up Simon Weiss from Flatbush, someone I could speak on. We actually used him in a varsity tournament this year. And he held his own in varsity. He's not a player who's going to score a ton of points, but he's going to be the player that makes all the right decisions. And that's very important for a team because that keeps the ball out of the net. And if you keep the ball out of the net, you have a chance because goals happen in weird ways. And if you're preventing them, then you have the chance of getting a weird one.
Yeah.
So that, him along with the players who happen to have played varsity last year and moved up, having that experience coming down, it makes them a team that you think is in the hunt and in the bubble.
Yeah. And unfortunately for me, I don't have the exact name at hand right now, but Ramaz, just as a whole last year, started with their, with a JV team last year, and then they lost the number of players that they needed in order to field that team for reasons I don't know. But what I do know right offhand is the fact that they forfeited the rest of their season, and any players that were still able, that had the time or the ability to play, they put on their varsity team so that they wouldn't have a lost opportunity to still be able to play hockey, get some experience. One of those players was their goaltender who was playing on the varsity level. And this is where I don't remember the name. I really wish I did. But is going to be their JV goalie this year. And that could be a big, that could be a big piece for them. We talked about how Zachy Weiss played for Hafter last year, and he's going to be a huge piece for that JV team this year. We talked about how you had Joe Catton on your varsity team when he was a freshman and he scored 12, 13 goals and then had a really nice sophomore season. With that being said, imagine how that could play out for Ramaz this year, but especially the goalie, that could be the most important piece of this team this year. If he finds a way, because he still played well on the varsity level, if he finds a way to put it together, that could be a dangerous team. They really can be. And with a bunch of unknowns, that makes them even more, formidable because there's not much to go by. You don't know your tactics and your strategies, and there's a saying that the most dangerous attacker is a dying and a desperate one. Now, Ramaz isn't dying or desperate to my knowledge, but with that being said, you got to know your foe too. And if no one knows what that team has to bring, it could be a very similar situation in JV for them, like it was for YD in varsity last year, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and also I will say, when you're moving back down as a goalie, it's like playing softball versus baseball, like slow pitch softball.
It's a game changer. The speed and the level of shots that you're facing and the quality also.
Yeah, you also have to think about he wasn't playing in a soft division. He was playing in a good league,
playing in the
in
West
the best of.
He played TABC and Frisch and SAR and Kushner. Yeah, they tough schedule, and
he had
really, although wasn't a game breaker at that level, found a way to, to really improve himself still.
Yeah, look, he had 8 games against elite talent at the varsity level. Now he's coming down to play in JV. When you consider that 8 games is almost the whole JV season. So the amount of development you expect from a player who has done that and didn't get absolutely shelled, moving back down, that is, he's going to be a big part of that team.
Yeah, you will. All right, so that wraps it up for our in the hunt category. So now let's move on to the contenders category. So we've got DRS in no particular order. We have DRS, TABC, and SAR in this category. Why don't we start with DRS? So DRS last year, the runner-ups of last year's championship game, they lost to TABC in overtime, as mentioned before. I see a lot in this DRS team of what I saw in their team 2 years ago on the JV level, and not necessarily by a level of talent, by a level of depth, but really in the way they're composed. There's a really good mix of 9th graders and 10th graders who can both immediately be playing roles together, more than 9th graders when it comes to immediately playing roles, because the 10th graders have proven themselves, obviously, more than the 9th graders, having a year of JV hockey and at the high school level under their belt. But I really, really think that this is the team that if you were going to look at over the last couple of years that you'd compare to that team 2 years ago in DRS for JV, that this would be the one that you compare them the closest to.
Yeah, I think they're also a team that I'm in a way concerned about at this top notch part, right? Like they could easily swap with Frisch, right? Because, and the logic I'm going to put with it is that a lot of, like, in years past, they had a little bit more help from their freshman classes where they got experience. They didn't get as much help last year from their 9th grade class.
Yeah,
it was mostly
right.
Josh Lambert. Ami Marks got a little bit, but it was mostly a 10th grade class, for like a strong 10th grade class for them last year. And you're going to look at like an Eliav Rothbort who didn't get as many minutes unless it was really the end of games. And you're going to ask, and you're now going to say, look, you were really good in middle school. You didn't get as much time last year. Now you have to do it as a 10th grader.
Right.
And that's where they're going to need to, have people taking a step up, because in a sense, while you didn't have the year off, you didn't have a year of game experience in the JV level. And now you have to take that step up, and you're going to have to support a very, very good player in Josh Lambert. Now, these players do have the talent to do that, right? It's not a massive concern, but it's one of those ones where, hey, all these guys around a really talented player, you need to step, or a talented 2 players, you got to step up. They also have a very nice goaltending situation. They have a few talented goalies that they could roll with either one really at any given time, and they could be comfortable with that. So
Yeah.
they have a ton of talent, and they have a lot of depth. It's going to be a matter of everyone playing, to the level they can.
Yeah. And look, this goes for every team, obviously. If there are teams that meet their expectations, then they can end up higher, or that meet expectations higher than, what they're expected around the league, or from excuse me, for even like their coaching staff. It was sort of be like the type of thing where I'm sure, when you were coaching that Rambam team in 2013-14, you knew that your level of freshman talent was very high, but could a team full of freshmen carry you guys as far? And I'm sure it was a very nice surprise back then. And I'm sure that this year, DRS is going to be, I think, a little more reliant on on their freshmen, as you mentioned. And I think that, if they get that same level of being surprised as you got back then, who knows? I mean, DRS has been notorious for always being a powerhouse, and if they're not going to be a powerhouse, at the very least, they're going to play hard. They're going to want it more than any other team whenever they play. It's always been their motto: hustle and heart, and just never say die. That's always been what they've been about, and it's never failed them, in a sense that they've always been competitive, and they've
never missed the playoffs.
Yeah, they never missed the playoffs, and there's always a level of expectations and a very high standard that they set for themselves, and they never ever quit when it comes to trying to meet that standard, and more than enough times, at the expense of other schools. Sadly, they, it's unfortunate. Someone has to win, someone has to lose. But DRS, they've got a recipe for success that very, very rarely disappoints them.
Yeah, I mean, my comments are also in holding them to a DRS standard, right? Like, if this was a team with less prestige, we'll call it, or less history,
Right.
right?
They might be lower down.
Well, I think that we would be talking about how much talent they have versus like how much inexperience they have, right?
Right.
Because the expectations from DRS is championship or bust
Right.
every single year.
Yeah.
So that's really them,
Yeah.
you know.
Okay.
And
So let's move on to TABC now. TABC, and for those of you wondering why, if they were the champions of last year, just bear with us for a second. So TABC wins the championship last year, but similar to DRS, very, very, very loaded class of 10th graders. Now, they did get a nice bunch and group of 9th graders, but those 9th graders did not play as much as the 9th graders from DRS did last year. So I'm sort of intrigued really to see where that will go. Now, that being said, there are some really nice pieces still there. They have Benjamin Kornick, who really, in his time, made the most of his opportunities last year, and Jeb Fields, who's coming from a line of brothers, and Shea and AB, who are split between TBC and Frisch. But they're still they've set high standards for themselves, and they've met them, despite being years apart. And Jeb's not really far behind them by any means. He's also going to be an outstanding player. And in net, you've got Natan El-Kal, who is going to be one of the best goalies, if not the best goalie on the JV level this year. But even he didn't see so much time last year with a guy like Shai Forgash playing in front of him, who finished as one of the top goaltenders in the JV league last year. I mean, the kid won co-championship MVP for a reason. So now my question is, they got a nice load of 9th graders for their class too. The question for me is, where is their talent level at in terms of the 9th grade class they got? Because we know that they're going to be deep. They got, I think, the most 9th graders of any team that brought in a class of 9th graders in terms of numbers. I don't know just how much talent that will be able to support that they lost from last year.
yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting play for them because they do have a good class, and they're going to, no matter who's in net for them, they have 3 goalies, right?
Yeah.
I mean, no, 4 goalies.
Yeah.
Right.
They got
Yeah,
five. They got 5 freshman goalies this year. One of them was put on varsity. The other 4 stayed on JV.
Yeah, right. Because it's the
Just goes to show, and they
Radsdorfer.
can
Yeah,
win with all 4 of them.
yeah. Right. So it was Radsdorfer, Cutler, Mandelbaum, and then they have
And they have Kalbar already.
yeah, and Cal. Okay. Yeah, and then so they're gonna be comfortable with whoever they have in that. Like it, well, they could rotate if they really want, though you're not going to when you have Nathaniel Cal. And when you have it, and when you have the experience that they have, and but they also have the inexperience, it's a very similar conversation to DRS. That's really the best way to put it. But that's where you always leave. It always leaves room to grow, and actually, it even if you start off slow to start the year, it gives you the runway to really pick it up.
Yeah.
And then it also sometimes having something to prove is a good thing.
Yeah.
And it's the same way on both DRS and TABC, where because you're freshmen and you're at times you're going to feel a little bit disrespected, like right now, right? We're not giving them necessarily this massive amount of credit, or we're throwing doubt in the air. That could, using that goes and it pushes you forward. I know with my Rambam team, where we were considered the 3rd best team in the division, things like that, and then we ended up going and finishing 1st. And a lot of that came because of how much doubt there was, and people were talking a lot about how it was we were the number 3 team. It actually pushed us to be the number 1 team and end up going to championship and losing to TABC. So that's really the story. I think it's just similar story for both teams.
Yeah. And that's really why we wanted to compare them back to back. So now let's move on to our final team in the contenders category, our final team in all of JV in the SAR Sting. So the elephant in the room, obviously, as we mentioned earlier, is SAR a predominantly JV team, a predominantly 9th grade team for their JV team last year. And they were 8-2. They had a really nice season. And none of those pieces, I don't want to say none, but a lot of those pieces that did the heavy lifting for them last year are coming back this year. And then you throw in the addition of a couple of really good freshmen that have high expectations and a lot of hype coming into this year.
They also picked up 10th graders.
Yes, they did.
They picked up, right? They had 2 transfers from 10th grade, right? They got Sadiq Nathaniel Sadiq from Hank, who was one of the better players on Hank as a middle schooler. Got a little bit of time at the varsity level last year and is now over at SAR. Then they I'm missing on the second one. Who the second one was, but I believe he came from Miami, right? I don't know.
On
You can correct
varsity.
me
I
if
know
I'm
you're
wrong.
talking about. He's on varsity.
Oh, he's on varsity. Okay, fine. So that's a
Yeah. We'll get to that when
different
we
transfer.
go over varsity.
Okay, fine. But then when you build on top of that, they're just loaded with talent. They're the team that, like, if you were to come in and have to pick a favorite, that's the team you're picking.
Yeah.
Jack Linhart and Nate Zitter are the top line in the league. They have a very good goalie in Michael Goldman. They have they picked up an unbelievable freshman class, right? They got Neowitz, they got Catler. They got it's one of these teams that they're going to be able to go 4 lines deep on every single team in the league,
Yeah.
and that means a lot, honestly,
Yeah.
because it means no matter who you're going against, they're good and they're never tired.
Yeah.
So that's
I
going to
mean,
be, yeah.
yeah. I mean, look, I mean, there was a reason Jacqueline Hart was nominated when we did our award show last year as a first, a first all team offenseman last year, where there were only 2 spots for that. There's a reason he was nominated last year. He tore it up. Nate Zitter was very, very close, not too far behind him by any means. And they get to play together for another full year. They enjoyed a lot of success last year as freshmen against teams like DRS, like TABC, like Frisch, like MTA last year. These were all playoff teams and teams that competed at a high level. And again, it's something that I don't think something we didn't mention, but something that I'll mention real briefly is they've got that advantage. They play in the rink, they know their space, they know their angles, they know what they need to do to get it done. They were able to do it last year and they picked it up real fast as freshmen last year. I'm, it's not like I'm saying this because I picked them as a favorite, but I'm really excited to see where they can go this year to watch it. They're just a really fun team to watch play, if you ask me, from having seen them last year as freshmen.
You
I'm
could
really
also
excited to see them do it as sophomores, especially with the additions of guys like Adine Catler and Jonah Neowitz, as you mentioned, coming in as freshmen, who will play, in all likeliness, very key roles for this team.
Yeah, there are also 2 more points to it also. Last year they faced adversity and they also showed that they're not scared of anybody.
Yeah.
Right? They're not scared of anybody. They went head toe to toe in SAR against TABC and were winning the game until pretty much the end, and then TABC in the last 2 minutes made a comeback. And that was huge because that TABC team was excellent and and also a year older than them for the most part. So that was big. And then in terms of then you look at their first round of the playoffs, right? They went and they played an older Flatbush team, or well, it's a mixed Flatbush team, but carried by some older players, and they went down early. They went into the third period down, and they were not playing well in the first period. And then they came out in the second and third and blew the doors off the game and ended up winning by like 4 or 5 goals.
Yeah.
So you see that they have the right mentality coming into games, which makes you think that they're not really going to go and play a team that they might view they're better than and go, oh, we could just stroll into this gym and win. They're going to come at you no matter who you are.
Yeah, with everything they have, and they're not afraid to. They're fearless, as you mentioned. Even against DRS in the semifinal game, they played their hearts out, and similar to the game that they played against the ABC, despite the fact this one was on the road instead of at home for them. They had the lead in that game with just around like half of the third period left, maybe a little bit more, maybe like a little bit over 6 minutes. They scored early on in the third, and then DRS, got momentum off of a power play, tied it up, and was able to ride it out throughout the rest of the game. But they were right there with them, and that they could have very well made the championship last year. It was so neck and neck that sometimes all you need is a bounce, and they were a little short of getting it. And maybe it came with some inexperience last year with the fact that they were a predominantly 9th grade team. Now that they're 10th graders this year, they'll know how to find that bounce.
Absolutely.
All right, so that wraps it up for our JV segment. So let's get into varsity now. With that being said, again, same 3 categories. We've got a prove it category, an in the hunt category, and a contenders category. There are 2 divisions, so we go back a little bit more back to normal when it comes to varsity. There's an East division and a West division, and the playoffs work as follows. So there are going to be 5 seeds making the playoffs in each division. So it's not wild cards like it was last year with the 1 seeds getting buys. 5 teams in each division are going to make the playoffs, the top 5 seeds. With that being said, the way that it's broken down is that the 5 will play the 4 seed cross conference in a wild card game. the teams that win those wildcard games will become the 4 seeds in in the cross conferences. And then what's going to happen after that is the 1 is going to play the 4 cross conference, and the 2 will play the 3 cross conference after those wildcard games have taken place. And then from there, it reseeds, and it's a straight, and there's a bracket, and that's how you get to your championship games and ultimate winner. But that's a long way down the road. Let's get to the breakdown. We started with the teams in the East last time, even though there was only one division. So let's start with the teams in the West this time, Avi done. So in our prove it category, so we have 2 teams. So we've got JEC and we have Hillel. Let's get right to it.
Yeah, I think we can start with JEC. JEC's JV team, they only had a JV team last year, and that team did not win a game.
Yeah, they went 0-10 last year.
They went 0-10. So it's going to be on them to show that they're better than they were last year in JV. And let me say that if they have any 12th grade talent, they have a little bit of 12th grade talent, which means that they didn't really play last year, but I believe that means they were involved in varsity the year before.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah. So they have talent that is now joining that the kids who were in JV last year. And you hope that maybe that can help push them up and show that they are better than what they were in JV last year. When it comes to Hillel did not have a team at all for the last 2 years. So all their players are very inexperienced. The only experience they really have are a couple exhibition games that they played, and the Flatbush preseason tournament. In the Flatbush preseason tournament, their first game was against Frisch, and they had a tie game 1-1 going into late into the third period, and then they let up a goal to lose the game. Right, and they came off, while they didn't dominate play, their goalie played really, really well, and they looked okay. You know what? Their goaltender might be able to hold them in games, and if they could get enough of offense, they might be able to make some noise.
Yeah.
Then they went up against Hank, and Hank scored a lot.
Yeah, Hank lit them up on the board, and it wasn't just like over the course of a game. They got to them early, and it sort of snowballed. So, I like, my understanding for Hillel is that inexperience obviously is going to play a huge factor. But I mean, look, you never know. Sometimes, like, if their goalie is going to play, it almost seemed like they almost tired Frisch out a little bit in that game. That's why they were able to end up with a goal at some point, and Frisch found, a little bit of extra gear super late in that third period and won the game. So with that being said, like, my understanding for Hillel would at the very least be, having been at that tournament and seen them play, that, it's going to have to come from their goalie to hold them in games. And, like, we'll see if they could get enough offensive pushes to be able to withstand that. Because I don't think that they're going to be a team that's putting up consistent offensive looks throughout an entire game.
Which, while it's not an advantage, it could be a disadvantage for an opposing team's goalie, because it's hard to stay sharp. So you might see them scoring. If they could keep the score low, they might be able to sneak a goal or two in, and be able to make games a little bit tighter than they might look when you're watching it.
Yeah.
Right. So those are the 2 teams that we have over in the Prove It section, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so let's jump over to In the Hunt. So we have 4 teams in this division now. So we have MTA, SAR, Kushner, and we also have Ori Sorrel. That, interesting breakdown. I guess I'll address the elephant in the room. So Ori Sorrel didn't have a varsity team last year. They make our In the Hunt category because their JV team played competitively last year, and they have a varsity team that has grades 9 through 12 on it. And even though they're a younger team, because they don't have a lot of 11th and 12th graders, their 9th and 10th graders they have on this team are going to play big minutes for them, and they're going to play impact roles. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that the talent floats to the top, right? And they have talent, right? It's Abramson, and they got Piatak, who are both 10th graders.
And Froman.
And Froman. Right, so they have talent. The question is going to be, how quickly do they adjust to varsity? If they can adjust quickly, they have a chance at a playoff spot. If it takes too long, they're a team that could make other teams' lives more difficult to make the playoffs.
Right.
If you play them late in the season, and let's say they were a little bit more of a rollover in the beginning of the season, but they're competitive at the end, it could throw a wrench in your schedule.
Yeah.
So that's they're going to be a team to watch and watch grow, because they're going to be a project for future years.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, let's get on to MTA then. MTA, another team that's in our in the hunt category. MTA for me, last year their varsity team just missed the playoffs, but they also lost some massive pieces. They lost Noam Kornwasser, and they lost one of the top scorers in the league last year, and Donnie Greenberg. Now, what happens is they're going, and they didn't have such a deep junior class, but they had some good pieces. They had Yosef Warren, who was a good offenseman for them last year. Then Alex Cooper was a solid offenseman for them last year. They had Avi Glick, who was a good defenseman for them last year. And Jesse Morgan, even though he was shadowing time along with Akiva Morris, stepped up and played in some real big games. And although didn't necessarily get the results statistically, to know he played well and to build himself up for this year, he is one of the better goaltenders coming into this year for varsity. So that could be a good piece for them. And then their JV team went to the playoffs last year. While they weren't outstanding, we mentioned that they had a good mix last year of 9th and 10th graders, the same thing that they will have this coming year in JV. Two of the big pieces are coming up to varsity, and they had success as 9th graders. And we're talking about Yoshua Radsker and Chaim Simon, two guys who we know can mesh with the guys above them because they did it 2 years ago. The big question for me is their depth. I don't know that, in a league where everyone's talking about, especially on the varsity level, how depth has to be such a huge, huge, huge piece, to the puzzle for a team to be able to put it together and find that next level, I think is where MTA will fall short.
Yeah, I think they're a team that is perfect for this category in a lot of ways, because they're a team that could be very solid. They're a team that could just miss. They're really hanging around there, where they're not what in ways they're not necessarily what they were last year, where Donnie Greenberg would score constantly, right? Like we played them in Flatbush, and I think he had 5 goals in a period and a half.
Yeah.
Right. And it was for no necessarily fault of Flatbush or not, it was a good
He's just one of the
team.
best scorers last year.
Yeah, he was just lighting up the scoreboard. And so you look over at, what they've lost. The question is going to be, right, can these players who are coming in really fill the gap and to the level that they need? And could they see growth from, kids who are more depth 10th graders, or last year's 11th graders who were more depth? Could they see enough growth to be able to pick the team up to the level that's needed to make the playoffs?
Yeah. So I think that'll be an interesting question that will get answered throughout the season. For SAR and Kushner, let's move on. Let's compare them side by side, because these are two very similar teams for me. There's one real big obvious difference, to me at least, that separates these two teams. So we'll start with SAR. They're the reigning champions from last year, and it's going to be a tough title to defend with some competition ahead of them now, because they definitely take a drop. The reason they take a drop is because their senior class was really their lifeline last year. I mean, you look at, they lost Gabe Hornblass, Eitan Kraus, Ari Fenster, Judah Hain, Micah Gazal, they lost Matty Unger in net. They lost Jed Konovich and Elon Lurie, just to name even though I'm going to say just to name a few, there were so many more names on that list. It just shows you how great they were. Now, with that being said, one of their mainstay pieces from last year was a junior, and that's Asher Rudman, who is back for a ride with this varsity team, and he'll be one of the best players in the league. There's no question about that. But the rest of the juniors around him from last year weren't really pieces that were really huge to that SAR team. And sure, they were there on paper, but I'm looking at this team and I'm saying, they're seniors this year. Obviously, they'll have Asher Rudman, who will be a good player for them. But, it's kind of question marks just because of the lack of playing time that most of those juniors got last year that are now seniors. Now, where they make up for it is their juniors this year, who were 10th graders last year, had a very successful season in JV. And you get guys like Sammy Glass, like Mo Jeter, that are going to move up, and like Ari Levine, just to name a couple more, who are going to move up. And, they 2 years ago weren't such a bad team. They played competitively. Their issue was keeping the ball out of the net. And unfortunately for them, that seems to still be an issue for them. They have 3 goalies, but there's just like a level of inconsistency that they seem to be starting the wrong goalie at the wrong time. Well, other goalies tend to have. I mean, you saw in the tournament. Now, if you go over to, and also, a big piece, forgot that now they get a transfer in Elijah Kuehl, who might have a tough time adjusting to play because he's used to playing in a massive gym in North Shore. Now he has to go to that confined space in SAR and play in that small rink. But that might be an advantage for him being an ice hockey player and knowing how to use bounces like that. Now, if you compare them with Kushner, SAR, at least we've spoken about, they've got some depth because they have a nice return of players coming up from last year's JV team. Kushner, on the other hand, was a team that made the semis 2 years ago. But similar to SAR, their goaltending is a question mark. And on the flip side, they only rotated 5 guys. So we know that their talent that they have amongst those 5 guys, they have Sammy Steiner, James Orbach, Kobe Eisenberg, Sean Felderman, and Jacob Schnipper. But are 5 guys, as I mentioned with MTA, going to be enough to be able to take them to the top of the class?
Yeah, I think it's a overview of both teams, right? SAR, they have there's also their JV team last year was carried by their 9th grade class.
Yeah,
for a large part of it. And yes, these players were contributing parts of it, right? But they didn't gain the elite offense that they had at that time. So they lost a ton of offense. They didn't necessarily add a ton to it. Now look, Elijah Kuehl is an excellent player. So they did pick up a really, really good player, but they lost like 6 top offensemen or whatever, like something like that, right? So 1 doesn't replace 6 pretty much ever. And so the question is going to be, what are they going, what is going to come in and who's going to step up to be able to help them do really well? Because look, we for the Flatbush tournament, Yeshiva Flatbush didn't have a goalie available to play. And so SAR was lending over their goalies, right? It's because they brought 3. And so we played SAR in the first game, and the goalie that played for Flatbush played really well. Game went to a shootout, went like 8 rounds in a shootout. SAR ended up winning, but it was great, right? Especially because Flatbush was playing with 6 players. They were facing shots, and he was making saves. So he played well, but then in the next game, he was the starter for SAR, and did not do as right. They played YDE, right? So, and then YDE ended up going and winning that game. So it really speaks to that level of inconsistency of you don't know what you're going to get, and it's going to be up to one of the 3 to now step up. And they have the talent to do it. That's not, I don't think that's the question. It's going to be about who does it.
Right.
Because they all can do it. So that would be, I think that's a good description. With Kushner, they have really good players, but they don't have a lot of them. They just don't have a lot of players. And at the varsity, it worked at the JV level, right? And it was difficult for them at the JV level, and at times they had to play a very, like interesting
Very
system where they wouldn't go all the way in. They wouldn't always attack the ball when they cleared the ball out. They would conserve energy. By the varsity level, it's different, and it's going to be interesting to see how they play it, because right, they could be winning games through 2 periods but run out of gas, right? Because they have very good players, they really do. But if a team makes them run and really makes them work,
that could be the downfall for them. It might just be over right then and there.
Yeah, so if you can't move, then you can't play. So maybe they try to drop into a 1-2-1 and try to just play ping pong hockey just to keep the ball out of the net. But that's going to be it's the depth that you ask about.
Yeah. Anyway, that clears it for the rest of our in the hunt category. Now let's move up to the contenders category. So we have TABC and Frisch in this category. I'll let you go ahead. Let's talk about Frisch first. Frisch is coming off a championship loss. Just to give it a little bit of background, last year they lost to SAR in overtime. In a game they had a 3-0 lead over the Stingen, and they lost their dominant line of Jakey Fight and Ethan Alter and the defensemen on that team. Too many to name. We won't get into it, but they still have some mainstay pieces players who were mainstay pieces on that team last year as juniors who are back for a ride this year. So, I mean, how do we think that'll sort of play out for them this year?
They have a lot of depth, I think. I think they have a lot of players who could play, and that's going to be their advantage.
Yeah.
And they have good players.
Yeah.
And the question is going
on top of it. We know that.
Yeah, and they have great goaltending. So they're a team that is going to come in and they're going to beat a lot of teams just because it's kind of like the opposite of Kushner in a way. While they do have the talent of where Kushner's issue might come down to, running out of gas. They're a team that you don't expect to really ever run out of gas and to be able to wear teams down. And
Right.
they're going to come in. They're going to be very well structured. They're going to be well organized, and that means you're not going to let up a lot of goals. And you're going to have good goaltending, so you're definitely not going to let up a lot of goals. And they have the talent to go and score the goals. So they're going to be a team that a lot of teams are going to have a very hard time beating.
Right.
And they're going to play like a real, like the games are going to look good for them because they're going to be able to dominate possession. They're going to be able to keep, they're going to be able to keep teams to the outside and not get amazing opportunities. And they're going to be able to really beat up on a lot of teams.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to look interesting. They're definitely not the dominant powerhouse they were last year, but they are definitely a rock solid team. They're going to be tough to beat this year. And I think, again, like it's going to show that, on the JV level, different coaching staff. Now Jaak Lisker jumps in as the bench boss, as one of the top coaches in all of Yeshiva League hockey. That I think that's also going to play a factor. Now let's talk about TABC. TABC comes in as one of the favorites, if not the favorite, to win it all this year. Let's start, obviously, the elephant in the room. Now they get Mo Fuchs. Everyone, and this is with every JV team that moves up from TABC and becomes varsity, as Mo doesn't coach them in JV. As involved as he is, he's not coaching that team. Here he is taking this group of players that lost in the championship 2 years ago with a record of 10-0. So they went undefeated and lost in the championship to the only team that they really had any sort of trouble putting away. That was DRS. We'll get to that. This TABC team is loaded, absolutely loaded top to bottom. I dare say that, like, in the last 3-4 years, this is the most loaded team TABC has put out, top to bottom, with their depth, their scoring threats, their defense, and even at their goaltending position, they have multiple options they can run out there comfortably and know they've got a really good chance of winning that game, and it's not going to be a hole. It starts at the top with Matis Krause and Shea Fields on offense. Probably going to be the most dominant line in the league offensively this year. Then you go a line below them, and you've got Ben-Sion Kaiser and Aiden Rausman. I was talking to Mo Fuchs about this earlier, before the season really like started to get closer to starting. He said he doesn't call them a first and second line. They're 1A and 1B, and he's right. Because quite honestly, I think those are the two best lines in the league. And the fact that they're on the same team shows a lot. And then on defense, you're going to have Aryeh Simon, Yonatan Brothman, Aryeh Zikovich. They got a transfer from last year, playing his first year at TABC, but Ethan Moskoff, who played for Frisch a couple of years ago when these teams were JV, is now going to be on this TABC team. You get Max Borger healthy now for a full year. And this all goes without the fact that I've also haven't mentioned Ezra Alter yet. Ezra Alter 2 years ago in the JV level was a top 5 player, top 5 offenseman for sure, if not player, in the league. And if that kid is now on your third line because you switched them up because Matis Krause is playing offense now instead of defense, and he's probably going to be the most dominant offenseman in the league this year, he's that good, then it just goes to show. And there's so many more names on this team I can't. And obviously, like, let's talk about Amichai Dresner in net also. The kid had a really nice season last year whenever he got the chance to play. It wasn't only the Chaim Mermelstein show last year. He got to play in some big games, got to play against Frisch. He won that game, got to play against SAR, and they won that game. That was the one that was in SAR. He got some time in that game as well. With that being said, now Shia Forgash comes up behind him, having had an incredible season in JV. I mean, I just don't see any holes on this team that anyone in the West will be able to penetrate. Anyone in the league, very possibly. I mean, like, what else is there?
Well, I think there is a little bit of, I'll use your term, the elephant in the room, is that this 12th grade class has been at a TVC level disappointing.
Yes.
They have not performed, as in 10th grade, losing the championship. 11th grade, don't make the championship. You're now in 12th grade. Yeah. So you're now in 12th grade. You have all this talent across the board. Now you have to take advantage of it. And that, in a way, I don't believe that this championship this year. And that gives them a little bit of extra jump because they missed out on their previous opportunities.
Yeah.
And you just don't want to miss it, 3 years in a row when you're at TABC.
Yeah. All right, so I mean that wraps it up for our West, but I think that we made it pretty clear the criteria we were going by based on how we rank teams in our categories, along with other factors that came into it. So now let's jump over to the East. So similar ranking again. We have our teams that are ranked towards the bottom in the prove it category. Then we have our in the hunt category and our contenders category. So let's go ahead. Let's work our way from the bottom up again, and let's start in the East now with the the category.
Yeah, so with the prove it category, we have Solomon Schechter and we have North Shore. I think it's actually interesting because they're both rivals. They both consider each other rivals. Solomon Schechter and North Shore split, I believe, last year.
Yeah, they did. They split.
Each one got one win, and then that was their win. North Shore, while they got their class from JV, losing Elijah Kuehl is a massive loss for them.
I mean, he's their best player.
Yeah, he was the best player on that JV team, and he probably would have been the best player in the varsity team. And so you lose that talent. While you do pick up a very good goalie, it's going to be now on them. And by the way, with Elijah Kuehl, right, when they were in JV, I believe they were the bottom team in JV.
They went 3-7 still, yeah.
Yeah. So you're looking at them and you're like, you were 3-7 and now you lost your best player. Yes, you got to step up with your goalie's better than he was, but other people are now going to have to fill in this, very, very large hole for this team. And then over at Solomon Schechter, they haven't had success in a long time, and they're a team that every once in a while comes out and just pops off.
Yeah.
I mean, the last time they made the playoffs was, what was it? It was your 11th grade year.
Yeah, that was the last time North Shore made the playoffs in the varsity.
No, Solomon Schechter.
Oh, and Solomon Schechter. They played each other, ironically enough. But yes.
Yeah, so you're looking. Actually, I think I reffed that game. But you're looking at both. You're looking at it. For both these teams, you're looking at two teams that haven't made the playoffs in a long time. But at the same time, when it comes to Solomon Schechter, you don't know what you're getting from them, really, ever. And last year, the goalie they had, who wasn't a well-known goalie, had games where he was outstanding.
Yeah, he did.
And that's going to be the thing with Solomon Schechter every single year when you're talking about this. You're like, I don't know what I'm going to get, but every once in a while they come out and they have playoff level seasons, and that's something to note. Like, it's hard to speak about them in depth and really give you a good overview because they are really the ultimate unknown when it comes to this league.
Yeah. So that wraps up really for the closeout in our bottom tier, in our prove it tier of the East Division. So now let's go and let's do this a little bit differently. Most of these teams now that we're about to mention in the hunt category all mirror each other. So similar to the way we went Kushner SAR, let's put these teams side by side and see what they have in common, what they really don't. And basically, I guess we'll start last year. We'll start with YDE. YDE has a similar team this year to the one they had last year, except they're not as deep. They're going to have the same coach. Joey Saff did a great job last year. I wouldn't put it past him to do his best again this year and to give them, a special result. Their issue is that their schedule is so incredibly difficult after the run they had last year. So already just looking at that, they would have been, they were an unknown last year, and because of that, now they're an unknown this year because they get TABC, they get Frisch, they get SAR and DRS a couple times now. Like, it's going to be a bloodbath for them, and I don't know that because they lost that depth now, if they have that to recover from.
Yeah, look, they're going to need another result like they did against DRS in YDE.
Yeah,
they're going to need to do that.
Maybe against another team also. Maybe they'll have to do it against Frisch or SAR, maybe even TBC. Who knows? No one gave them much of a shot last year. They shocked a lot of people. They'll have to do it again.
And look, it's going to be on them to prove, to prove that they can handle this schedule. But they also have the coach who's shown that he's able to do it.
Yeah.
So it's going to be on them to do that. Yeah, and then if we keep this all in Brooklyn, right? If we go over to Mag and David has a very, very talented team. They do.
And they're not, by the way, they're also a good mix, but they have a lot of 10th and 11th graders on this team. So let's not look past that either.
Yeah, but they are carried by Henry Towell. They're carried, he's a star player in this league, and he's not known because, he's not playing for a big school, but he is an outstanding hockey player. And the problem that Mag and David runs into is that they need to stay out of the penalty box.
Yeah, it's
Because
been the same
they
thing.
I think they must have lost 5 games last year because they couldn't stay out of the box because they were taking 8 penalties a game. You
Yeah,
can't do that. Because if they stay out of the box, and yes, they have questions in that because they lost their starting goalie. There's now their backup goalie from last year, but they have the talent to beat you on scoring, and they have the talent to keep you out of the net as well. So stay out of the box. They have a chance. Don't stay. If they keep having 8 penalties a game, they're gonna run
yeah,
themselves out
they
of a
will.
playoff spot.
Yeah. But
But,
let's keep things in Brooklyn. Let's jump over to Flatbush now. It's
well,
someone you can speak
yeah,
to on a really good level, we know.
yeah. So Flatbush is an interesting team. There's plenty of talent that exists in the team, but they're weird circumstances. So we'll start in net, right? Omer Yadov is a very solid goalie, right? But he's going to be missing the beginning of November, and he hasn't played. He's only played 2 sessions of hockey, basically, coming into the end of October. He's at a practice and and a game. So there's going to be question marks in net now for quite a few games. Then the really big loss is there's no David Kish, who is an outstanding hockey player at the similar level of a Henry Towell.
Yeah.
Um, he's not playing until Thanksgiving because he's out with ice hockey. So will Flatbush be able to do enough in their first 5 games without David Kish and without Omer Yadov to be able to go and with their last 9 games go on a run to be able to potentially make a playoff spot? It's going to be a difficult ask,
Yes.
but there are players within the team who could help. But again, it is 2 very big losses because the replacement in Ed is a 9th grader, and there is no replacement for David Kish.
Yeah.
So that's going to be the difficult story for Flatbush.
Yeah. Let's close it out. The last team in the hunt that we have is Rambam. I'll go over them, having coached them the last couple of years, and then obviously the elephant in the room is that I will not be with that team this year, so I can give the dark secret, so to speak. Rambam's breakdown is very simple, and their game plan is very simple because I know a lot hasn't changed. They've got one of the best first lines in the league that will score you as many goals as possible. They got Zevi Herskowitz and Mendel Rosenberg, who have been doing it since 10th graders together. And they're not, again, like, people know more about them now, but they're still a little bit unknown. So I think that could shock some teams as a little bit. I wouldn't call it an advantage or a disadvantage. It's just like something that happens. With that being said, there's not much offensive production below them. They have players they'll roll out. They sort of, like, I'd compare them to Frisch in their style of play, where they had Ethan Alter and Jakey Fight going out and lighting teams up on the scoreboard. And their second lines wouldn't go out there, and their second and third line wouldn't go out there and light it up on the scoreboard. But, they'd sort of chip the ball in deep and get their offensive line, above them, a little bit of rest, which is sort of what I'd expect them to do this year because Rosenberg and Herskowitz have the talent to do that. But, I don't know that the lines below them do. So it's going to be a battle for them. And then on the flip side, you've got, for the defensive aspect and the goaltending aspect, they've got 3 lines of defense that can all be trusted. My question is how they will all adapt, like how you balance the time for them, that it doesn't look like you're overplaying one and then one team, one line falls a little bit flat because they're not seeing as much time and you're not rolling them out there. In net, we know that they have one of the best goalies in the league, if not the best goalie in the league, in Rami Kesak, who, despite the fact he's a junior, was elite 2 years ago on the JV level as a 9th grader. It took a lot of people by surprise, a lot of players and teams by surprise. Last year was the best goalie in all of JV. And this year he mirrors that team from 2 years ago. And look, they made the playoffs 2 years ago. And they were in there in games against DRS, against Frisch, beat Kushner, like they could very well go on an interesting run and put themselves in an interesting position. So that's sort of like where I'd go, but I just can't call them contenders yet. With that being said, let's move on to the contenders category. Let's start it off with a team that's a little bit unknown. Let's go with Hank. Hank, 2 years ago, didn't have a JV team. What do we know about them, Avidan?
Well, LA is hockey. That is one thing we certainly know, right? He's either 1A or 1B as the best 11th grader. He has scored, at least 60 goals in varsity already, and he's going into 11th grade. Really, really outstanding player. We know they have Josh Frankel in net. He looked good last year. It was his first time playing goalie, and now he has a lot of experience. And we know that they're going to be a well-drilled team. And they also Isaac Morales.
Yeah.
So they're going to be a well-drilled team. They're going to play their system perfectly because every single player on that team's been doing it for the last 7 years.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a team that's going to be difficult to beat, and a team that's going to have the star power to score on legitimately everybody.
Yeah. All right. So that's really all it is on Hank. It's just going to be the fact they didn't, they're a little bit more unknown because they didn't have that JV team 2 years ago. So not much really in terms of like how you go and handle them right off the bat. With that being said, let's move on now to our next team that we have in the contenders category, the Hafter Hawks. Hafter snuck into the playoffs last year on the varsity level. They had a tough schedule, and they also had a team full of 11th and 12th graders. Not many, if any, 12th graders that were impact players, even if it's just one, the only one there. They were carried by Jacob Wolf and Jonah Oliner and Jonah Fish and a grade below them, Max Newmark in net, who's a top goaltender, and Zach Newmark, his twin brother. And we mentioned in the JV portion of the episode that Zachy Weiss came up and played minutes. Now he won't be on the team this year, but that Hafter team is going to be tough to beat because not necessarily because they're going to outscore you so much, but they're going to be a good defensive team this year, just plain and simple.
Yeah, I'll also add that you don't well, I haven't been told anything. You do wonder if Hafter's not having as great of a season in JV if they decide to just move Zachy Weiss up to play varsity and give themselves a better shot.
Yeah, that'd be sure.
Yeah, and so they have elite goaltending and they have elite goal scoring, and that's a very nice pairing to have because Max Newmark will be able to cover for any defensive liabilities that they have, and Wolf, Oliner, and Newmark will all be able to score more than enough goals for that team to go and pretty much beat up on a lot of the teams in the division.
Yeah.
So they're going to be just a very good team.
Yeah, and I also want to point out the addition of James Goldschmidt, who wasn't playing for them 2 years ago, but is a two-sport star, played basketball primarily the last couple of years. He's going to be a big piece for them as well, planning to play hockey this year. He was at Camp David. I had the opportunity to coach him there. He is an outstanding player. He's very athletic, speed, skill. He's very intelligent, despite the fact that he hasn't played hockey, Yeshiva League hockey so often. He's a complete player and a potential to be a game-breaking player. If you throw that into an already really solid Hafter team, maybe that brings them over the top a little bit and puts them in a category where they can legitimately be competing for a championship, along with TABC, who we mentioned earlier, Frisch, obviously in the other contenders category, and also the team we're about to talk about now, which is probably the team that you favor second overall going into the championship matchup, and that would be DRS. DRS 2 years won the championship. They were the team that upset TABC. However, they also did lose to TABC, and TABC was shorthanded for that game back when that happened. I know that I'm not going to go back over the whole narratives. DRS won the championship in the end. They got the last laugh. So they're neck and neck, and they play in different divisions, so we'll give them the respect they deserve. Otherwise, it wouldn't be respectful. With that being said, this team is loaded. Similar to TABC, the interesting thing and the difference that I really like in them more than I like in TABC, if there was one obvious thing I'd have to point to, because many of them are not so obvious, it's tough, is the fact that they have a better mix of 12th and 11th graders, I think, than TABC, whereas they're more 11th grade heavy than they are 12th. And even though the 12th graders they have are all phenomenal, the ones that DRS have could be just as phenomenal, if not better. And then their 11th grade class is also rock solid. And you're looking primarily into two players on this team that didn't play tremendous minutes for them 2 years ago that will be doing it this year. And those names are Micha Khan, who we know, for unfortunate reasons, having shelled your team last year, broke out and didn't see as much time 2 years ago on the JV level until down the stretch, but he'll be a main contributor to this team as an 11th grader this year. And the other guy being a transfer student in Daniel Cinnamon, who was a big piece of the Rambam team 2 years ago that made the playoffs and had a nice regular season. But now he's with DRS, and that just loads up a defense that is already, in my opinion, and I'm sure in the opinion of many others, probably the best defense and the toughest defense to get by in all of the Yeshiva League Varsity Hockey League.
Well, I'll even add on top of that Jack Greenbaum did not get that many minutes,
Right.
And was not as super effective as he could have been as a 9th grader. As an 11th grader, he has taken the jump, and I think that is abundantly clear.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a big difference for them as well. They are a better team than they were 2 years ago.
Yes.
And they won the championship. They are almost the opposite, though, in a lot of ways, of TABC. While TABC is going to come out and try to shell you, DRS is going to play lockdown defense where it's going to be difficult to score. They're not going to give you a lot of really, really good opportunities. And then they have very good offensemen. And they probably have the best offense in the class, right? I mean, in the East. But at the same time, it's not to the level of a TABC. So you, in a way of splitting hairs almost, what you want to see from them is more goal scoring and a greater variety of goals, right? Not everything being the same goals, but they could beat you in different ways.
Yeah.
So yes, you can keep everybody out of the net, and that is very, very important. Defense wins championships. But can you do enough to score to beat TABC? Because that's the matchup that we're going to talk about all year.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I don't want to take away from guys. We simply just too many names to list off, but obviously expect to see emergent seasons from guys again, like it's Ude and like Ellis Bornstein will probably go back to offense with more defensive help this year. And as you mentioned, Jack Greenbaum's going to play up to a bigger role this year than he did 2 years ago. And also Ben Ritter, who has worked his way onto the top line the last 3 years after starting on the third. His fight is going to be there. And let me just tell you, I mean, like this team overall might be the best well-rounded team overall, where they have scoring, not a ton of it, but a good amount of it, and it's top heavy, and the best defense. And that could be, as you mentioned, defense wins championships. So it'll be very interesting to see. And obviously, when time comes and when it's appropriate, we will certainly be talking about that matchup. And they're going to play TABC during the regular season. There's already a game scheduled on I believe New Year's Eve in DRS. So that'll be a really hype game when time comes. Only one way to find out, though, is to experience it. And overall, I think we're set for 2 great seasons, both in JV and in varsity. I really can't wait to watch it all unfold.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really, really interesting seasons across the board, and I think it's going to be exciting in the middle, especially.
Yeah.
Right, the playoff race and the teams trying to get in. It's going to be fascinating all season because every game is going to matter.
Yeah, season hasn't even started yet, and we're already talking about that. That's going to be one of the highlights of this year for both JV and varsity. So I'm really excited to watch it. And with that being said, that's going to do it for our first episode of Season 3 in Yeshiva League Pass Face-Off. So once again, I want to thank all the viewers for tuning into this episode of Yeshiva League Pass Face-Off. Avidan, thank you so much for joining me in our season opener, our third season opener, and it was an absolute blast. And finally, once again, I want to remind all of our viewers who are sponsored by, reminding them that is the Weiselberg Law Firm. Once again, please choose wisely.